So we created our first model, and this one we're going to change this model. That is, we're going to add to it because we probably want more data. So we're going to talk about that. Now, before we can jump in to actually make the changes, I want to talk about the fields in particular. So if we take a look at the documentation, what we see here is inside of models, fields, and field types. It doesn't really matter what version of Django you're using here, so you could even go to dev. Or you can also search Django model fields, and that will bring up the model field reference documentation. And then if you scroll down to field types, this is where all of them are. Now, auto field. What is auto field? So I think I mentioned before that we have these IDs already inside of every model. So if we click on them, we see there's an ID there. That is an auto field. There's a good chance you're not going to use this field directly, as it says in the documentation. So it's already there, and it's already automatically creating integers known as the IDs for each and every model instance. This is something that's really good about inheriting from the model class. That's part of the reason why you do that. But we have all these other fields. We have big integer field, binary field if you use binary, a Boolean field like a true-false value, char field, we've already done that one. But you can scroll down and see all of the various kinds of fields. We will use more of these fields in the future. But in this one, what I want to do is actually use another char field, and I'm going to call this shortcode, and I'll do models.char field. And now you might be wondering, okay, I put this max length here before. Well, the max length is actually a required item for the char field. If it's listed there, that means it's required. In fact, it will tell you that the char field has one extra required argument, and that is max length. And if you don't put max length, it will raise an error. So you can actually go through and see some of the other ones as far as required is concerned, right? So in the email field, it does have a max length there, so you can change the max length, but it doesn't say anything about it being required. And then file field has optional arguments. You know, if you go through, you can see the things that are required and the things that are optional. The things that are required are usually going to be told to you that they're required when you run the next few codes. All right, so we have this shortcode in here. This is going to be related directly to every URL. Remember, we're doing this redirect thing, so we're going to have a shortcode in here that's related directly to that URL. Something that you have to note here is if we save this, we can now actually add this into the database. But the important part is it's not already in the database, right? So the shortcode field, that is not in the database, but the cur URL is in the database. So what we're doing here is actually making changes to how the database is mapped. That is, we're just changing it to fit with this model itself. Think about it if you were like using Microsoft Excel or Apple numbers. When you make a new column, you create that whole new column. Now, in this case, we are going to be creating a whole new column, but the database needs to know that that column exists, and it needs some values for those previous columns, right? Or we need to know that it can be empty. So right here, let's look at this right here. So we have a value for our two. Oops, I want to comment this out for a second because I did save it. But we have these two values here, right? So if I click on them, there is a value and there's actually something in there. Now, if I added a new field, the database needs to know what those new values are going to be, right? So if I added a new field as a line, I need to set the previous field's values, right? Or the previous instance's values, the previous objects. Now, there's a few options that I can have, but let's go ahead and just put it in here blank, just as if I didn't do anything. I just saved it as this, and I went through without actually setting the things that I need to set. Now, I have two terminal windows open. One is actually running the server. Another one is just inside of the actual virtual environment, and if I list everything out, I see that I'm in the root of my project. That is, of course, where manage.py is. Now, if I write out python manage.py and make migrations, this is the command that you want to run every time you save models. We've already said this. Every time you do anything to models, you want to run make migrations. I press enter, and it gives me this system check error. This is that error that I was saying. Char fields must define a max length, right? I did that before by default, but in this case, I'm going to do max length. And let's think about how long we want our shortcode to be. Let's say, for instance, we want it to be 15. That's the max length that we want it to be. I'll go ahead and save that. And that's all characters, so 15 characters long. That's the absolute max that I'll ever do on that shortcode. I might be able to, I can change it in the future, but right now, let's just say that's what it will always be. I go ahead and do make migrations. Now I get this error saying you're trying to add a non-nullable field to shortcode. In other words, the field has to have some data in it the way we wrote it here. So I have to define something. This is basically saying pick a default now for all the other existing values. Remember, these are existing values here. And I'm adding a new field to them, so I need to give them some sort of existing value. It's kind of like if I was super powerful and I could give every person in the world, or every new person in the world, so every baby that has yet to be born, I could give them another arm, right? So now, from here on out, every baby in the world has another arm. I can just give it to them. I've now decided everyone's got that. Well, what do I do for everybody else? Everyone that's already alive, do I give them another arm or do I not give them another arm? That is kind of what's going on here. And we can decide whether or not we want to give that extra value or put something in that value for this particular item. Now, there's a few ways around this. Now, I'm going to just go ahead and write these ways below here, and I'm not going to actually leave them, so I'll keep them commented out. One of the ways we can solve this issue is we can say null equals to true. That means that it can be empty in the database. By default, it's null. Here's the defaults. Null equals to false and blank equals to false. I'll explain blank in a second, but we've got null equals to true. That means empty in database is okay. Another one we could do is default value. And this is going to be the value that whatever we end up doing for the shortcode, all of the other ones would have a default value. So in our case, we could say CFE default short code. Now, I don't actually want to have a default value, right? And I also don't want it to be null in the database. I want to make sure that this is a required thing. So when I have it in there, it's absolutely 100% required. That is something that I really, really, definitely 100% want to do. So, but I've run into a little bit of an issue because I'm adding the shortcode field after values already exist. So that's something we will solve. But for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this as is, just like that. Of course, going back to this, you could use either one of these, or you can use them in conjunction with each other. Default and null could be in there. That's okay. So let's actually go back and see what the options are. So we can provide a one-off default, meaning all of the old rows will have this value. And now all the new rows, everything going forward will not have that value. Otherwise, I can quit and set a default or set null being true in the database, or excuse me, in the models.py. So I could do 2 and then come in here and use one of these fields, save that and go back. But I'm going to do 1. And what I'm going to write is this CFE default value. And the CFL default shortcode, this I want to use it as a string because remember it's a char field, so a character field. If that was an integer field, I could use integer field. If it was a timestamp or a date time field, I could use time zone because that module is available. But I'm going to use CFE default shortcode. I'll press enter, and that is now what it is. So it created a new file called migrations. So if we jump into our source file here and we look into our app inside of migrations, we now see that we have this cur URL shortcode. Here it is. This is the actual migration that was created. This is now showing the database what's happening, right? So when we want to migrate, it's going to apply each one of these migrations if they have not been applied already. So I'll go ahead and save it, and then now what I'll run is python manage.py migrate, and I'll press enter, and notice it's applying that migration. And if I try to migrate again, it's not going to apply that migration because that migration has already applied. Migration meaning it's going to change the database now. We set up the database migration change, or we said, hey database, we're going to change you to this soon. That's what this migration file is for. Notice it was automatically generated for us based off of what we did in models, and after running these commands, then it went off of what's in there. So here's the previous default, and notice how it says preserve default false. It means that it's not going to keep that default, so every value going forward is not going to be that. So if I refresh inside or make sure my server is running and I go into the admin, I now see that I can see my default shortcode in here. Well, this is great, but I also want another aspect of this shortcode, and that is I want unique being true. So unique meaning that I want all shortcode values to be unique to this model. So nowhere on there should these shortcodes be the same, ever. I also might want that same thing with URLs, but definitely with shortcodes, right? I don't want duplicate shortcodes. Duplicate URLs is not as big of a deal as duplicate shortcodes. So since I added that unique clause, I'm going to just change one of these that isn't unique simply by, and if I try and type in here, I can't type. I can still type up here, but I can't actually add anything. If I hit save and continue, boom, I already got an error. This is cool. So it didn't run the error for the default, but remember we had our max length at 15, and this is more than 15 characters. This is okay because we're going to add that unique equals to true. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and say CFE 123, and I'll just hit save, and then I'll go to the other one and do CFE 1234 and hit save. So now both of these are unique, right? Each shortcode is unique. Okay, great. So we'll save models.py, and then we'll do it again. We'll run our migrations. So we'll we want to do Python. Notice that I said migrate, and it's saying, hey, you models have changes that are not reflected in migration. I'm glad that we saw this, because now it's basically saying you have to run make migration. So Python, we can actually press up a couple times, press migrations, and again, it made that field for us. It's altering the field this time by adding unique equals to true. That's all that's happening here. Notice it says alter field versus add field, just really kind of explaining what's going on with the migrations. And now we can run Python manage.py migrate. We press enter. Those migrations happen. I refresh in here. Now if I try to do CFE 123 like the other one, hit save and continue, it will give me this error. That's really cool. Okay, great. So we're going to leave it at this. And in the next one, what we're going to talk about is what happens if your migrations just get out of whack. What do you do? If you have any questions on this, let us know. Otherwise, let's keep going.